Hi, I'm the political geek that is Martin Curtis, and this is Change from the Centre. And it won't surprise you that this week I'm going to talk about Iran. But what I'm not going to talk about is Donald Trump's decision to go into Iran. I'm not going to talk about what's going on in Iran at the moment, and nor am I going to talk about the rights and wrongs of Keir Starmer's decision to stop Donald Trump from flying bombers out of UK sovereign territory. All of those things are being done elsewhere, and in reality, they're not really what Change from the Centre is about. I want to talk about lessons that we need to learn from Iran as far as domestic policy is concerned. And there's a reality to this, which is many of these lessons could and should have been learned 4 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, because that was the point at which we should have woke up to the fact that the world is a changed place. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is the desperate need for the government to publish its defence infrastructure plan. Now, this is a document they've been promising for some time, which sets out how they're going to achieve 2.5% of GDP spent on defence. I would argue 2.5% is now out the window, and it should be 3%. But this document has been promised for a long time, and I suspect hasn't been published because Keir Starmer is worried about the response from the left of the Labour Party. But as I've said before in another one of these videos, sometimes you think that Keir Starmer just needs to grow a pair. And certainly as far as defence is concerned, he needs to do what he thinks is right and what is clearly right, which is to start saying, actually, we need to start growing defence spending in this country. This is how we're going to do it. And more importantly, how are we going to get beyond the point at which we're just building defence infrastructure? So what I mean by that is, how do we get from a point where we're building drone factories to a point where we're building drones? As an example, the way I look at it at the moment, it would take 6 or 7 years for us to reach a point from saying, yes, we're going to build that here, to a point where something meaningful is coming out of it that adds to and enhances the defence of our realm. Let's face it, the issues around what happened in Akrotiri and the fact that it's going to take a week and a half for a ship to get out there that can do a job of defending Akrotiri and Cyprus indeed is pretty shameful. I think the media described it as the Navy's most shameful ever time. And I think I would struggle to say yes or no to that, because our Navy's been around for literally hundreds and hundreds of years, but it is certainly a modern low point. And it's not the fault of the navies, it's the fault of the politicians who are not doing the right thing. It's absolutely clear now that the UK has to start spending more money on defence. I think that must include an Iron Dome system for the UK and an Iron Dome system for overseas territories as well, because that is how we're going to cope with modern warfare. Because modern warfare is not about soldiers fighting soldiers anymore. The bad guys are not just doing that. They're taking out civilians, and we need something that protects the UK from that. The next thing I want to talk about is oil. I think most of us are absolutely sick of the world at the moment, where as soon as there's an international crisis, the cost of oil spikes, the cost of gas spikes, and then we start to see an impact on our economy. It's particularly annoying at the moment because the Iran crisis has happened at a point where we can see a pathway down to 2% inflation. And all of a sudden, we're looking forward to a spike in inflation. So I'm going to suggest something different here, and hang with me because the first part of this is quite controversial. And that is that I'm going to suggest that we start drilling in the North Sea again, and we start licensing drilling in the North Sea. And there's a practicality about that, which is the world is not going to stop relying on oil anytime soon. And so all we're doing by not drilling in the North Sea is harming our own economy. But what I am going to suggest is that we start doing something different with the revenue. So rather than just throwing it into the exchequer and letting them do what they want with it, the exchequer should put it into a sovereign green fund. And we use that sovereign green fund to develop a massive increase in solar and wind on rooftops, so that domestically we can start to drive down our reliance on gas. We can start driving down our reliance on oil, and we can also reduce our energy costs. And I would also suggest the same with industry, who are really, really suffering with cost of oil and the cost of energy at the moment. And I think this would do two things. It would do that bit where it drives down the reliance on oil and drives down the reliance on gas. I think also in the long term, we would be able to develop real expertise in the solar industry and in the domestic wind industry. And at the moment, there is a real fear that the only country that's massively investing in solar in particular is China, and that they are therefore stealing an international advantage where they are going to be able to sell solar, and the best solar at the cheapest prices, around the world, because we haven't invested in the sort of technology that we need. So this is me thinking a little bit differently. It may not be the right idea, but it is different. And that's part of what Change from the Centre is trying to do, is make people think a little bit differently, make them realize that just the status quo, as far as British politics is concerned, is not working. Before I move on to the last part of this video, I just want to make a quick plea. If you've enjoyed what I've said, if it's given you some food for thought, will you please consider liking this video and also subscribing to the Change from the Centre YouTube channel? Both of those things really, really help me plan. So if you could do that, I'd really appreciate it. So the last thing I want to talk about, I've talked about in another video, and I'll put a link to that video in the description, but it is about the need for a written constitution. It does not make sense for me for us to have a constitution in the UK where we're making decisions about the rights and wrongs of going to war based on years of history, rather than something that's laid down in solid legislation that politicians can read and understand, but also that political geeks like me can read and have a reference to. The decision Keir Starmer made to stop Donald Trump using RAF Fairford and Diego Garcia were based, as I understand it, largely on a legal decision. And the Conservatives have challenged that, as have others, but all based on convention rather than a firm piece of legislation that says this is when we can go to war and this is when we can't. In this case, it was about somebody flying bombers out of the UK, and that does matter because those bombers are going to kill people. But it could get worse, and it could be worse. We could get into a fight about whether we go to war and send our troops to war and send our soldiers to their death, all based on years of convention rather than based on something that me and you can clearly understand by reading it. And I think this is really important, and this has really reinforced that point that I have made previously, and actually others are making as well, to be fair. So I hope what you've seen is me doing something that actually sets out a little bit of different thinking about domestic policy, learn from Iran. There's a reality, which is that we can't just keep going on as we are and making the same mistakes. And I go back to what I said at the start, which is some of the things that are happening now, we could have learned lessons 4 years ago and tried to prevent them, and we didn't. And, you know, the Ukraine-Russian conflict is still the biggest issue that we face as a country. But actually, both of them are important, and both of them highlight that our world is a much less stable place. And we need to start changing what we do as a result of the fact that our world is different. Thanks very much for watching again. I really do appreciate it.